The silk felt like shackles, and her silence became the price of survival. Amara Delane stood perfectly still in the mirror, her reflection draped in imported French lace. The soft silk hugged her frame, delicate and dazzling, but to her it wasn't a gift, it was a warning. Behind her, the golden door creaked open. "You look stunning," came the low voice. Sebastian Vale, billionaire tech mogul, revered by the world, feared by her heart. She didn't speak. She knew better. Words, in this marriage, weren't currency. Obedience was. Only 5 days had passed since the vows were exchanged. 5 days since her world had changed in a whirlwind of manipulation, charm, and a contract she had never meant to sign. Just 2 months earlier, Amara had been a third-year law student with a future so bright it nearly blinded her. Her days were filled with books, late nights at the university library, and dreams of defending those who had no voice. She came from humble beginnings. Her mother was a retired nurse, her father long gone. Amara's strength was inherited, carved, from years of watching her mother endure, survive, and push forward with grace. Her scholarship kept her afloat, but barely. And when her mother was diagnosed with an aggressive heart condition, the choice was no longer hers. Surgery, urgent, life-saving, expensive. Enter Sebastian Vale, He was tall, refined, and disturbingly persuasive. She first met him at a university fundraiser, where he donated a staggering sum for future justice warriors. His speech that night ignited a standing ovation, but Amara had seen something else in his eyes, something calculating. She would later discover that the scholarship program was a front, one of many tricks Sebastian used to scout women who were both desperate and brilliant. He never called it manipulation, he called it opportunity. So when he invited her to a private proposal, weeks later with a legal contract in hand and her mother's hospital bill already covered, Mara said, yes. Not out of love, out of terror, out of sacrifice, out of survival. By the 5th day of marriage, Amara had everything. A mansion in the hills, designer dresses, servants, jewelry. But she had nothing, no voice, no power, no freedom. Every morning, a box awaited her on the silk-sheeted bed, a different outfit, usually delicate, always uncomfortable, and beneath it, a note in Sebastian's handwriting. Beauty has its rules, follow them. She obeyed. For now, because rebellion wasn't just risky, it was dangerous. Sebastian never hit her. He never yelled, but his control was cold and silent, a fog that settled over her like a weighted blanket. Everything in the house, every decision, every conversation revolved around him. Amara was, in public, Mrs. Vale, praised for her elegance, admired for her grace. But behind those perfect smiles lived a prisoner, and yet, behind his eyes, something else brewed like he was hiding a war of his own. Late one night, Amara slipped out of bed and wandered into the vast library. She wasn't allowed in there without permission, but something pulled her curiosity, perhaps, or desperation. There, tucked behind the rows of dusty books, she found a photograph, a woman. She was laughing genuinely, free, and standing beside Sebastian. The back was labeled, Alina Vale, my first and only love. Amara stared at it for a long time. That name had never been spoken. That laugh, nothing like the Sebastian she knew. She realized then, he wasn't just cruel, he was broken, and broken people break others. The next morning, Amara did something bold. She left the lingerie untouched instead. She wore a modest silk robe and walked downstairs to breakfast. Tall and silent. Sebastian looked up from his paper, paused. Eyes narrowed, but said nothing. For the first time, she had disobeyed and lived. That day, something shifted, not just in their house, but in her. The house was silent again. That thick, uncomfortable silence that wrapped around Amara like invisible chains. But something about this morning was different. Yesterday, she had defied him just a little. It had been a quiet rebellion, nothing more than leaving the box untouched. Yet, it had felt monumental. And the strangest part, he hadn't reacted with anger. He had only watched her, like he was trying to understand something about her that even she didn't understand yet. Amara moved through the grand hall with a calmness she hadn't known in weeks. Maybe it was the early sun pouring through the windows. Maybe it was the subtle shake in her hands that reminded her she was still alive, still thinking, still planning. She had no blueprint for escape, no friends she could trust, No outside contacts that hadn't been screened by Sebastian's ever-watchful assistants. But she had her mind, and if there was one thing Sebastian hadn't broken yet, it was that. She spent her day pretending to smile at the housekeeper, pretending to be engrossed in the latest luxury brand catalog Sebastian's assistant had left for her, pretending she wasn't counting every second until Sebastian left the house that afternoon for a high-profile investor meeting. The moment the doors closed behind his black car, Amara went to work. She returned to the library, not for books, but for secrets. She remembered the photograph she had found tucked behind the bookshelf. Elena Vale. That name still echoed in her head like an unanswered question. Who was she? And more importantly, what had happened to her? Behind the same row of old books, Amara found something she had missed before: a journal. The leather cover was worn, the spine cracked. She hesitated, fingers trembling, then opened to the first page. But it wasn't Elena's journal. It was Sebastian's. The writing was messy, emotional, and as she flipped through the pages, Amara began to feel something she hadn't felt since the day she said "I do." Power, because each word on those pages peeled back the mask Sebastian wore so well. He had loved Elena deeply, madly, and she had left him. The entries blurred between rage, sorrow, confusion, and obsession. The last page ended abruptly. "I gave her everything. She still left. Maybe love isn't real. Maybe control is the only way to stop the bleeding." Amara closed the journal slowly. Now she understood. Sebastian didn't want a wife. He wanted a cage for his fear, a distraction from the ghost of a woman who had once made him feel alive. And in some twisted way, he had chosen Amara not for who she was, but because she reminded him of who he lost. She sat on the floor, knees to her chest, heart pounding. This wasn't love. This was a story repeating itself, a cycle she could no longer afford to play into. For the first time in weeks, tears fell freely, not because she was weak, but because something inside her had finally cracked open. It was in that stillness, in that ache, that she made a vow to herself, not just to leave, but to reclaim who she was before he ever found her. That night, when Sebastian returned, he found her in the reading room wearing her law school hoodie. Not lace, not silk, just fabric and memories he hadn't chosen for her. He stopped in the doorway, clearly surprised. "You're comfortable," he said coolly. "I am," she replied. He walked closer. "That's new." Amara met his gaze. "I'm tired of pretending." He studied her like she was a riddle he hadn't written. Then, quietly, "Did you find the library interesting?" She didn't answer, and she didn't have to, because he knew. The silence between them wasn't empty, it was a battlefield. But Amara wasn't afraid anymore. She knew his weakness wasn't his money or his charm. It was truth, and she was holding it now. If she could hold on long enough, if she could stay smart, stay silent when needed, and loud when it mattered, she might just win this. She might just walk out of this story on her own terms. She went to bed that night, not as a woman trapped, but as a woman quietly sharpening her wings. He could dress her in silk, cover her in jewels, control the rooms she walked through, but her mind, her fire, that he could never own, not anymore. And that was the beginning of the end. The dream woke her up again, but this time, it wasn't fear that shook her awake. It was the sound of her own voice, whispering a name she hadn't spoken aloud in weeks. Her mother's. Amara sat up in the dark, the silk sheets twisted around her legs. Sebastian's side of the bed was cold. He hadn't come in that night, or maybe he had and left. Either way, she felt a flicker of something unfamiliar: relief. She rose quietly, tiptoeing barefoot across the marble floor to the corner of the room, where she'd started hiding a small notebook beneath the baseboard panel. Just 3 pages. So far, ideas, names, details she'd memorized about the house. A list of security codes she had overheard. Small, dangerous pieces of a puzzle she wasn't sure she'd ever be brave enough to finish. But tonight, something in her had shifted. The silence no longer scared her, it made her sharper. She pulled a pen from the hidden seam of her robe and began writing. Not just notes this time, but a letter. To herself. To remember who she was before Sebastian. Vale's world became her prison. The door creaked. She froze. Sebastian stood in the doorway, his eyes darker than usual. Not angry, just unreadable. "You weren't in bed," he said. "I couldn't sleep," she replied. He didn't move, just stared at her, like she was slowly becoming someone he no longer understood. and maybe she was. He turned and walked away without another word. The next morning brought something unexpected. A package, plain brown wrapping, no logo, no designer label. That alone made her suspicious. Everything Sebastian gave her was always branded, always expensive, always meant to be seen. Inside this box was a single item, a silver key. No note, no instructions. She stared at it for a long time, then tucked it deep inside the lining of her purse. If it was a trap, she wasn't going to fall into it without a plan. But if it wasn't, maybe, just maybe, it was her first open door. Later that evening, while Sebastian hosted a dinner with investors, she explored. Quiet shoes, calm breathing, each hallway memorized. The key didn't fit any of the rooms on the main floors. But then she remembered something. The West Wing. Off limits, always locked. Even the staff avoided it. She waited until midnight. The hallway was dark. She moved fast. The key clicked into the door with an almost sacred silence. Inside the room was unexpected. Not another lavish chamber, not an office. It was a nursery, dust-covered, abandoned, toys untouched, wallpaper faded. She felt her breath catch in her throat. In the center of the room stood a rocking chair, and on a tear-framed photograph of a baby. Behind the frame, a small slip of paper, yellowed, folded. She opened it with shaking fingers. In Sebastian's handwriting. If she had lived, I might have remembered how to love. Amara sank to the floor. The man she feared, this man who controlled every breath of her daily life, had once been a father, or tried to be, and now, he was a man haunted by everything he had lost. The pieces made sense. The coldness, the obsession with control, the need to create perfection around him. It was all a fortress, not of power, of pain. She sat in that nursery for over an hour, the silence more human now, not less frightening, but no longer invincible. When she finally returned to her room, Sebastian was waiting for her. "You found it," he said, voice hollow. She didn't answer. "Why didn't you tell me?" she asked instead. He looked at her, really looked, for the first time in weeks. "Because grief is the one thing I can't manage." She nodded slowly, absorbing every word. It didn't change what he'd done, but it explained why. And in that explanation, she found her next move. He wasn't just her captor. He was a man still trapped in his own story. And if she played this carefully, if she stayed patient, she wouldn't need to escape by running. She could escape by changing everything, even him, even herself. She didn't sleep that night. The image of the nursery, the rocking chair, the dust that photograph burned into Amara's mind like a memory she hadn't lived, but somehow carried. Every minute after she left that room felt heavier. The silence between her and Sebastian wasn't just quiet anymore. It was filled with everything neither of them had said for weeks. By morning, something had changed. She didn't get a box on the bed that day. No silk, no command in a handwritten note. Just stillness. At breakfast, Sebastian didn't look up from his paper. He didn't comment on her loose cotton dress. He didn't ask questions. But his hands trembled slightly as he lifted his coffee cup, and that tiny betrayal of control told her more than any words could. He was unraveling, not in chaos but in confrontation with himself. She watched him, not with fear this time, but with clarity. There was a part of him trying to hold on to control, and another part aching to be freed from it. The same man who tried to shape her into perfection was, deep inside, a man who had lost something he couldn't fix. A man who had built a cage for grief and climbed in willingly. She needed to test him, not for danger but for truth. That afternoon, Amara went to the garden. She hadn't walked it alone since the first week of marriage. Sebastian had once told her the roses reminded him of Alina. They only bloom when handled with care, he'd said. Back then, she thought it was romantic. Now, she saw it as warning. She picked a single white rose and took it back to the drawing room. He found her there minutes later, seated beside the piano, the flower on her lap. "He picked it," he said. "I did." He looked at her with narrowed eyes, calculating. "You're not afraid of me anymore." "I was never afraid of you," she said softly. "I was afraid of who you became to survive your pain." His face twitched. "You think you understand me?" he asked, voice colder now. "No," she replied. "But I understand what it's like to lose something and not know how to move forward." He looked at her then, truly looked. "Do you ever think," she continued, "that maybe control isn't power? Maybe it's just another kind of grief that stopped him completely." And in that pause, in that heartbeat of quiet, something cracked. Not in him, in the world he had built around himself. "You're not like her," he finally said. "I'm not trying to be," she replied. "I just want to remember who I was before I gave up everything to survive." He lowered himself into the chair across from her. For a long time neither of them spoke. Then, without looking up, he said, "I don't know how to let go." She responded quietly, "You don't have to let go all at once, but you do have to stop pretending you're not holding on." The next few days were different. He didn't ask her to wear anything. He didn't leave gifts on the bed. There were moments they didn't speak at all, but there were also glimmers of something real, brief conversations, shared glances, silences that weren't empty. Amara started writing again. In her notebook, now half filled with more than plans, she wrote thoughts, questions, pieces of who she used to be. And slowly, her fire returned, not just to survive but to live. She knew this wasn't the end of the story. It wasn't even the turning point yet, but it was something just as important, a shift. One evening, as rain tapped against the windows, Sebastian approached her at the fireplace. "I read the letter you left in the nursery." She stiffened slightly. "I didn't think you'd find it so soon. I find everything in this house." Amara braced herself, but instead of the sharp retort she expected, he said, "You wrote that you didn't want to escape, you wanted to be seen." She looked up at him, eyes stinging. "Because no one ever asked who I was before I became your wife." He nodded slowly. "Tell me, then." That moment, small as it was the beginning of her reclaiming the voice she thought she had lost. Forever he didn't ask her to change, and for the first time since their wedding day, neither of them wore masks. The knock on the front door didn't sound like it belonged there. It wasn't soft like the maid's, or brisk like the assistant's. It was deliberate, three slow, heavy thuds that echoed through the marble halls like a warning. Amara froze mid-step on the staircase, the sound stopping her breath in her throat. From the library, Sebastian appeared almost instantly, as if he'd been expecting it, or dreading it. He moved past her without a word, but she saw the change in his expression. The calm mask he'd been wearing lately cracked ever so slightly. Something ancient, something wounded, flickered in his eyes. A minute later, she heard voices. Low, tense, urgent. She crept to the hallway and peeked around the corner, only to see a woman standing in the doorway. Tall, elegant, raven hair pulled into a sleek chian. No umbrella, no luggage, just an expression of composed fury. Amara didn't recognize her, but something in Sebastian's posture told her everything she needed to know. She wasn't a stranger, she was history, and history had come knocking. Amara stepped back quietly before they saw her. She retreated into the study and sat in the corner, armchair, heart pounding, not with jealousy, but with the unsettling feeling that the truth was arriving ahead of schedule. 10 minutes later, Sebastian entered the room. "Alone. She wants to speak to you," he said. Amara blinked. "Me?" she said. "It's important. About me, about this house, about you." He didn't say her name, wouldn't say it, but Amara knew now. The woman in the hall was the ghost that still lived in the nursery. Alina Vale. She followed him to the drawing room, hands cold, mind racing. Alina was seated near the window, still poised, still flawless. She turned slowly when Amara entered, her gaze unreadable. "You're her," Alina said. Amara nodded. "I was you," she added, more softly this time. Once, there was a long silence. Amara didn't sit. She stood with her spine straight, ready for whatever was coming. "I left him," Alina said, voice steady, "because I was afraid. Not of him hurting me, but of him loving me too much, in all the wrong ways." Amara's lips parted, but she didn't speak. "I thought distance would fix it, that if I disappeared, he'd forget me and learn how to live a normal life. But I was wrong. All I did was leave him with his grief, alone. And when grief is left alone for too long, it becomes something else. Control," Amara said quietly. Alina looked at her. "Yes." Amara sat down. "Why now?" she asked. "Because I heard he got married," Alina replied. "And I prayed it was real this time, that he'd changed. But then I saw the photos online. You smiling beside him, dressed in things I once wore, standing in the same rooms, the same poses. It wasn't a marriage. It was a repeat." The words landed like stones in Amara's chest. "He said he loved you," Amara whispered. "He did, in his own way. But love that demands silence, that dresses you up and calls it care, that builds golden cages. That's not love, that's memory trying to stay alive. Amara looked down at her hands, suddenly unsure of everything she thought. She understood. Alina stood and walked over to her. "You have something I didn't have," she said softly. "His attention, his respect. I saw it in his eyes when he looked at you. He's trying, Amara, but you can't fix a broken man unless he wants to heal." Amara's voice cracked. "So what do I do?" Alina looked at her with something close to sisterly sorrow. "You finish what I couldn't. You remind him that the past doesn't own him, and if he can't let it go, you walk away before you become part of the ruins." She left after that. No drama, no tears. Just truth left behind, like a letter on the table. That night, Sebastian didn't mention Alina. He sat beside Amara in the quiet, staring into the fireplace like it held all the answers he didn't want to say out loud. Finally, he whispered, "She was right, wasn't she?" Amara didn't look at him. "Do you want to be better, Sebastian? Or do you just want to feel in control again?" His silence was answer enough. She stood, walked to the center of the room, and looked at him fully. "If you want this to be real, I need to be seen, not shaped, not dressed, not handled, just seen." He looked up, and for once, the arrogance was gone. "I don't know how to do that," he said. "Then learn." She walked away before he could speak again, because this time, the silence wasn't her prison, it was her strength. ChatGPT said. The storm came without warning. It wasn't just the rain slashing against the windows, or the trees bending under. The weight of the wind, it was inside the house too. In the air, in the silence between them that had stretched thin over the past few days, like the sky before lightning. Sebastian hadn't spoken much since Alina left. Amara hadn't either. They moved through the same spaces like strangers who remembered each other, in fragments, flickers of warmth, flashes of pain. And in that silence, both of them were unraveling in different ways. She spent her nights in the guest room now. Not out of anger, but clarity. She needed space to think, to breathe, to remember the girl who'd walked into this mansion wide-eyed and terrified. That girl deserved closure, even if it didn't come wrapped in love. One night, after hours of pacing, Amara found herself in the nursery again. No key needed now. The door stayed unlocked, like the past had stopped hiding. She sat in the old rocking chair, holding the faded photograph of the baby that had haunted Sebastian's every choice. She wasn't sure how long she stayed there before his voice broke the stillness behind her. "I thought I could build something perfect," he said, standing in the doorway. She didn't move. "I thought if I controlled every part of it, outfit, every word, every moment, I could stop anything from breaking again." Amara looked up at him. "But I'm not something to be protected from breaking," she said. "I'm a person, not a project." He nodded, stepping into the room like it still scared him. "I see that now," he said. "Too late, maybe, but I see it." She stood slowly and placed the photograph back on the shelf. "No, it's not too late, but it's close," she whispered. "Because I won't stay in a story that's only about you." He stepped closer. "I want it to be about us now." She looked at him, really looked, and saw the truth not just in his eyes, but in the way his hands trembled, in the way his voice wasn't commanding anymore. He wasn't playing a part, he wasn't trying to control, he was just trying. "I've started therapy," he said, barely above a whisper. "I've avoided it for years, told myself I didn't need it. But I was wrong. I want to be a man who deserves you, Amara." She believed him, not because of the words, but because, for the first time, he wasn't using them to win. He was using them to let go. A week later, Amara stood in the middle of the same lobby where she had once walked in as a bride, with shaking hands and a silent heart. This time, she wore jeans and a simple blouse, no silk, no labels, just herself. Sebastian stood beside her, not as a man leading her life but walking beside it. "I'm leaving for a while," she said. He nodded. "I know. Not because I don't care," she added, "but because I need to find out who I am again, without fear, without shadows." He stepped closer, took her hand gently, and looked her in the eyes. "Come back when you're ready," he said. "Or don't. Just promise me, wherever you go, you'll live fully." She smiled through the tears that finally fell. "I will," and she did, because leaving wasn't weakness, it was power, and loving yourself enough to walk away from what isn't ready for you. That's the strongest kind of love there is. Months later, Amara stood on a stage at a law school graduation, giving the closing speech he had once only dreamed of. She spoke about courage, about identity, about rising without anger, but never without truth. Somewhere in the back of the crowd, a man in a simple black coat stood and listened, quiet, unseen, not controlling, just witnessing. And that was enough.